Hello and welcome to this joint Euronews Europarl TV debate in which four guests discuss a topic of vital importance and considerable public interest in front of a studio audience, some of whom are going to be putting questions to our panel. Our subject today is climate change, the failure at Copenhagen and the upcoming conference in Cancun, Mexico, about which nobody seems very hopeful.
We'll put these topics to our four panelists here. Connie Hedergaard, European Commissioner for Climate Action, asked about Cancun. She says she's not too optimistic. With her in the studio, three MEPs, Corinne Wortmann-Kool for the European People's Party, who chairs a working group on environment and economy. Satu Hassi for the Greens, who quit as Finnish Environment Minister over the construction of a fifth nuclear plant in her country. And last but not least, Roger Helmer from the European Conservatives and Reformists, who's both Eurosceptic and climate skeptic, if I may say. He doesn't believe in man-made climate change.
We have one more guest too. He's Mohammed Al-Hadrami from the permanent mission of the Republic of Yemen to the United Nations, who's also, because Yemen currently holds the rotating presidency, chair of the Group of 77 and China. Now, he's listening to our debate on the telephone all the way from New York, and he'll be joining us during the course of today's programme.
Let's start with you, Connie Hedergaard. As Danish minister, you hosted the climate summit last year in Copenhagen. Looking back, COP15 is remembered as a huge disappointment. You obviously failed to get the parties to agree on a binding deal on greenhouse gases emission cuts. So what went wrong?
I think that the will was not there. The parties did not want to make the compromises necessary. I mean, that was basically what went wrong. Having said that, though, I think that we should also sort of acknowledge that actually a lot of things were achieved, and that's what we're trying to build upon now for Mexico. And also don't forget that in the run-up to Copenhagen, many countries in the world who earlier never set domestic targets, set targets because they knew their leaders would face the world public opinion in Copenhagen.
Some people are saying that what we need is a change of politics. In a sense, if you gather so many nations around a table to discuss an issue like this, you end up with lowest common denominator results. You end up with the least results that everyone can actually agree to. And it might be better to, for instance, spearhead the thing with, say, the EU, the US, Russia, India and China sitting around a table and discussing it separately. I mean, Connie Wortmann-Kool, what do you think about that? Should we change the politics here?
Well, I think we definitely have to change the strategy, because that is what we have to learn from the Copenhagen failure. And we also have to learn from what we achieved. And that is what our commissioner said, that there are certain initiatives who are really working in the right direction. There are certain sectors who are very active in meeting the objectives of climate change.
Roger Helmer, you're going to Cancun. I mean, presumably you're not expecting there to be any sort of breakthrough there. I mean, you don't actually believe that climate change is man-made anyway, do you?
No, I think the prospects for Cancun are clearly worse than those for Copenhagen. I think one of the problems is here, we're sitting in the Brussels bubble and thinking our own thoughts and airing our own prejudices, and we've got to engage with the real world. Developing nations like India and China are not going to give up on development in order to meet Western targets. America now has a new Republican House of Representatives. They are not going to pass any far-reaching emissions controls. So it's not going to happen. And if we in Europe proceed with our 20% or 30% or 50% or whatever the latest number is we pulled out of the air, we are taking all the pain and we are getting none of the gain, because whatever we do, the future of energy, the future of economies is in the East, is in India and China, and they are going to be powered by nuclear and coal. That is what's going to happen.
Maybe we could bring in Mohammed Al-Hadrami at this stage. What's your stand on that, Mr. Hadrami? Should the fight against climate change take place on several smaller fronts, like the rich countries front and the emerging countries one? Some blame you for the failure of the talks in Copenhagen. Some say you weren't prepared to share enough of the burden.
I believe, just to explain a bit, the G77 in China is a very large group. We are 131 countries. We have countries like China in one end, and we have countries like the Maldives. They're different. They have different views on climate change, but they're equally important to the group. Having said that, in Copenhagen, I think the problem was in trust and procedure. And that really led to perhaps the failure in Copenhagen. It wasn't the G77 to blame for that failure. I think if we need to learn something from Copenhagen, is that not to repeat it again. And I think we should, all of us, look very hopefully with full hope and determination for Cancun, not to repeat Copenhagen and also to save our planet.
Satu Hassi, I mean, do we need to make these deals far more legally binding than they are? Because countries seem to feel free to wriggle out of them whatever they choose.
What is seems to be confusing for many people is that there is a legally binding emission reduction target only for industrialized countries, not for developing countries, for the simple reason that already in Rio in '92 it was agreed that industrialized countries who basically have started this mess, the climate change, and who can afford to start the measures, they take the first step, and Kyoto was meant to be the first step. Now we need the next step.
Okay. So maybe we'll turn to our audience now for a question from Joris den Blanken. You are the EU Climate Director for Greenpeace. Please.
Yes, thank you. It's maybe not very well known, but the EU, in fact, is very close already to meeting its carbon target for 2020. We have a vast amount of time, 10 years, to do 3% more emission reductions. And that sounds maybe great, but the risk is, of course, that the EU will really slow down and lose out on new green jobs, on new investments, on exports. And what does the panel think that we should do in the EU to stop that and to keep the EU's green crown?
Commissioner Hedergaard, I think it's a question for you.
Yeah,
First.
that's exactly in line with what our thinking is in the Commission, because what we presented back in May was to say, yes, there is one thing where it's linked to the international negotiations and what do everybody else do. But it's also in Europe's own interest to be ambitious in this field. And there I must say I disagree very much with Mr. Helmer. I think you would be disappointed if I did not. But I disagree very much that it's not about who's going to bear the cost and the suffering. I think all bigger economies of the world will have to pursue in the future a much more sustainable green kind of growth than the one we had when we built our wells in Europe and in other places of the world. And, you know, yes, there is this paradox that some parties are moving very slow around the negotiation table, but some of the same parties are moving very quickly in reality. Take, for instance, what they are doing in China, what they are doing in Korea. I mentioned a lot of countries before.
I can see Roger Helmer is definitely not agreeing with you there, Commissioner.
Well, the Commissioner tells us to consider what's happening in China, and that is excellent advice. What's happening in China is they're building a new coal-fired power station every week, with India not far behind. They are going ahead with coal, and their emissions will increase. Now, the questioner points out that we're within 3% of our European target, only, I have to say, because we're going through the mother and father of all recessions. And he asks about jobs and investment. The fact is that by imposing punitive policies and very high costs on European economies and European industry, we are driving jobs and investment and business offshore to jurisdictions with lower standards. So the effect will be that we will ramp up unemployment in Europe, but actually the environment will get the worst deal because we will go to places with lower standards.
That is the effect of much European... react to your position.
Yeah, well, it's a fact that China is increasing their emissions, but they are moving even more rapidly in the field of new energy technologies. Last year, they became the biggest investor in wind power in the world. For several years, they have every year doubled the wind power capacity. In all industrial changes and market changes, finally those ones who are among the first movers, they are the ones who benefit.
By doubling your electricity costs and forcing people into fuel poverty?
No, but can I just add one thing? It seems as if you, Mr. Helmer, thinks that we can only lose jobs in Europe if we are ambitious. No, we can also lose jobs if we are dragging our feet.
Yeah,
what we
true.
are faced with is how to find exactly the right balance. To be ambitious, but not be over-ambitious. That is what the political challenge here is all about, not just to come with a lot of claims that simply is not true.
The Spanish experience was that every green job created cost 2.2 jobs in the real economy because the high costs of green energy depressed economic growth overall.
I must just say it's not true. I come from a country where from nothing in 20 years we today have 20% of exports in the field of renewables and energy efficient products. So it's an example that you can actually improve your economy if you do this in an intelligent way.
It's clear that Mr. Helmer is much too defensive because we have a lot to gain on sustainable technologies. However, moving unilaterally to the 30% target, I'm very much against, because when we really want to fight climate change, we have to challenge also the United States, Japan, China, also to commit to binding targets. And as long as they don't do that, we should stick to the 20%. But that doesn't mean that we should lean back and do nothing.
Commissioner Hedergaard, the smart car company reckons that this new electric car that they're producing won't create a single extra job. Are we again guilty of trying to get hopes up too high?
No, I don't think so. I think that a lot of efforts have been put into trying to manage expectations for Cancun, because you can do a thing like Copenhagen once and then you mobilize world opinion and that's fine, but then you will have to do it differently the next time. And I think we can have a balanced package on adaptation, on forestry, on technology, on the finance part, some of it, the fast start finance, of course. And I think that we could also make progress in carbon markets and how to get transparency in the whole
You really
thing.
think it is going to generate new jobs? Because some people are very doubtful about that.
I believe that the jobs that we have to get for the future will have to be greener jobs than the jobs we had before. I think that we cannot, in a world where when my children will be my age, will be 9 billion people on planet Earth instead of now 6.7 billion, all of them wanting a share in the good life, then we simply have to become much more energy efficient and much more resource efficient. It's not just whether we think that would be nice to have, that is need to have.
Roger Helmer, I think I saw you jump.
Well, indeed, the experience, let's look at the experience, not the vague promises. The experience is that green jobs are short-lived, that green jobs result in jobs being lost elsewhere in the economy. Many green jobs are abroad. We're offering fantastic subsidies on photovoltaic systems, but the photovoltaic systems frequently are made in China or elsewhere outside the EU. We've seen wind turbine factories closing down for lack of demand. So on the one hand, we're talking about a wonderful future for wind. On the other hand, many member states are pulling back from wind investment, and companies making wind equipment are suffering. The problem that we face is with a technology like wind, it delivers an intermittent trickle of very expensive electricity. If it gets over a threshold level of about 4 or 5% in the system, then the grid starts to become very difficult to manage and eventually
I have to say,
unmanageable.
It is simply not true.
Well, it is true,
and
that's what all the
Denmark, where we
industry
have
experts are saying.
28% of all electricity
And you
stemming from
export
wind.
most of it free to Sweden.
No, that's our own consumption. It's just to say that it depends on whether you have a good grid system. And that was the point Corinne was making.
And you have the highest electricity bills in
You
Europe.
can, of course, preach that we should do nothing different than we did in the past.
I'm not preaching that at all. No, I'm saying that wind is bad. That's not saying that nothing new is good.
If we do that, then we will definitely lose a lot of jobs, because all our old manufacturing things, all industrial production has moved out long time ago. So we have to find out what is the future jobs of
We
Europe.
will lose jobs in the UK, and I will tell you why, because we will be facing blackouts by 2015, because our government is committed to 30% of our electricity generation from wind by 2020. Everybody knows it's physically not possible. Everybody knows the grid can't be balanced. All the industry experts, chief executives of major energy companies are saying we're facing a real danger of blackouts by the middle of this decade. That will do nothing for jobs.
Well, now you're in government. Now you're in government. Well, do something about it.
We've got these mad Lib Dems running the energy policy.
But what is, I think, the smart part of the European policy is that the percentage of renewable, that's European, that's a target we all have to meet. But what kind of renewables, that's up to the member states. And I think that is really, that helps to make the most effective choices. When Great Britain doesn't make the most effective choices, please change it in your country.
What about nuclear? Why can't we use nuclear if you want low carbon?
You can do that as much as you want.
But it doesn't count towards our renewable target.
Europe
Why not?
says nothing about whether you can that or not.
No, Europe should include nuclear as low carbon.
If you look at historical record on the link between economy and price of energy, you see, for example, Russia, for almost always they have had cheap energy. Has that created booming economy in Russia.
I think
No, they are only booming when the oil price is high because they export oil. But they have enormous energy wasting. Cheap energy prices lead to wasting of energy inefficiency, of economy inefficiency, of resource use. That's not an intelligent strategy for any country.
Well, let's talk now about the weight of developing countries in Cancun, and let's ask Mohammed Al-Hadrami in New York. Mr. Al-Hadrami, is the group of 77 ready at all for Cancun?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, we are. We actually, for the proposed package that was proposed in Tianjin in our last talks, we expressed our views that we are ready to a successful Cancun. Whatever we do in Cancun should not in any way compromise or prejudge the objective of reaching a legally binding outcome in the future. We agree that maybe it's a bit really not there that we could actually achieve the legally binding in Cancun, but whatever we do there should not compromise that objective in the future. And for that to happen, I think we need to focus on a roadmap that we could agree to in Cancun, so it would lead us, or to lead the process for us to advance forward, not like what happened in Copenhagen.
We have a representative of Business Europe here with us in the studio. That's Martin Westrup. And you have a question for the Commissioner on international carbon trading.
Yes, exactly. I would like to continue to focus on the international aspects of climate change, and as climate change is a global problem, it only has global solutions, as we are all aware. And one of the more cost-effective ways of addressing climate change on the global scale would be international carbon markets. And I would like to ask the Commissioner Hedergaard in particular, but also the other panelists, what you're willing to propose as concrete suggestions in Cancun on this matter.
I would say that our whole policy, as I know that you will agree, has been to try to secure that we could have a global level playing field. That's the whole idea behind the UN negotiations, else it would have been much easier to give them up a long time ago. So that's the whole purpose. And in Cancun, we will try to suggest different improvements of the carbon market. For instance, the way the CDM market works. Today, we have a lot of clean development mechanism projects in the emerging economies, the relatively rich developing countries, and 90-some% of the projects go to them. We would rather like to use that kind of money with them for more sectoral approaches, work with China and India and Brazil in that way, and then modernize and make it a bit more simple to have projects in the least developed countries, in the poorer countries. So in that way, we could modernize the international and global carbon market.
What I think is important is what the Commissioner said, is that we have to take care of the global competitiveness. So when we can have an emission trading system on a global level, it's excellent. But also other kinds of approaches, sectoral approaches for some countries, to also look into the good achievements in other parts of the world. For instance, the investments in research and development in the United States, the way they organize this, there we can learn from. So, but when we take the global competitiveness also, so not only what we want to achieve, but also the global competitiveness in our approach, and not only having our European ideas and trying to sell that to the world, I think then we can really make progress also for our businesses.
You can't expect a global cap and trade mechanism because the States isn't going to buy it, India isn't going to buy it, China isn't going to buy it. It's not going to happen. We are going to crucify ourselves.
What is the role of European business in that? I was really shocked of the news that big European companies are have given election campaign funding for those ones in US Congress who have been blocking the climate legislation. European companies like BP, ArcelorMittal, BASF, Solvay, E.ON, for example, they have given funding for those ones who fight against the US climate legislation. Here they are preaching of global solutions and level playing field, and in US they are doing their best to not get a global deal, to not get climate legislation in USA.
Thank God our industrialists have more sense than our politicians would be my answer.
But can I say that
it's not honest.
Our industrialists have actually been very happy with the CDM, and I think that could be confirmed by Business Europe also. Because basically that is sound logic. Instead of making some very, very expensive cuts in Europe, then some of the cuts we were going to make could go into new technologies in developing countries. Is that not a sensible way? Because that's a way that they get some of the new technologies, some of the energy efficient technologies, and our businesses will pave their way into new markets. So I think it's a pity that you just, obviously without sort of knowing a lot of these projects, I've seen some of them are actually very, very good, and they are transferring technology.
Well, that's all we have time for now. Will Cancun surprise us all and produce a result, or will it be marked down as another failure on the road to South Africa?
Well, we'll find out very soon, I suppose. Meanwhile, I'd like to thank Commissioner Connie Hedergaard and our MEPs, Corinne Wortmann-Kool, Sadhu Hassi, and of course, Roger Helmer. And we mustn't forget Mohammed Al-Hadrani in New York too. Thanks too to our studio audience and to you at home for joining us. From Brussels, from both of us, goodbye.
Goodbye.